All right, I guess we'll get started. Thank you so much for coming. It's really nice to see a lot of familiar faces, especially from the Conservancy, which we'll talk about in detail throughout the presentations. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We're going to try to do the best we can with the setup. You'll notice that the computer is not close to the people who need to use the computer, so we have a little bit of a teamwork thing going on. So, we'll see how it goes. So yeah, this is a really meaningful conference for me personally. I have some students who participated in a graduate course with me this past spring, and I have a collaborator in Lori Wallach from Queen's Memory, and of course Robbie Garrison from the Olde Towne of Flushing Burial Ground Conservancy. So this is really the culmination, although I think the work will of course continue beyond today, of a project that started last spring and that is really taught me a lot about public history that I thought we could share for this conference. Also, thank you to the conference organizers, CUNY Public History Collective, Aaron, Katie, the co-chairs of the conference, Center for the Humanities, Sarah Clifton for being awesome, John Winters for being awesome, Molly Rosner for being awesome. So anyways, we have a lot of content to get through, so I need to keep my remarks brief, but the title that we gave our panel is Resurrecting Local Public History at the Olde Towne of Flushing Burial Ground. And we're here to talk about the burial ground, first and foremost. And we're also here to talk about the amazing Conservancy that came together decades ago to fight for its proper preservation and recognition as a burial ground. And we'll get into what exactly that fight entails during our presentations. Like I said, we're also here to talk about a collaborative project that took place over the course of spring 2016 academic semester. Specifically, this is at Queens College and the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies, where I am a visiting lecturer and coordinator of the archives program there. By the way, my name is Johnathan Thayer. So I think, this was a new class. I designed it and proposed it and had it kind of revised by my curriculum committee. And it developed in a way that I think could be instructive for how a graduate level classroom in an academic setting can open itself up to include individuals from local communities, from public libraries, and to the deep roots of history that are within our local surroundings. So I want to make a case for 2 points, which I hope won't be too controversial. I feel like I might be preaching to the choir here. But the first one is, I really feel strongly that we need to, as public historians, broadly defined, embrace the power of local history. Local history is not for hobbyists, it's not just for antiquarians. Local history is an empowering field, and mainly because it's about people, it's about communities. And it has the ability to empower by bringing people together and to restore social meaning to everyday public spaces. And I think possibly this is what we're going to show today is an example of that. Second case I'm going to make is that we need to support our local public libraries specifically. Public libraries are not dying. In fact, their usage statistics are up. They've never been higher, especially in urban environments. And that's because public libraries aren't just about books. Public libraries, again, are about people, are about communities. And if you find yourself not needing to rely on public libraries, then good for you, because that means you have the means to purchase your own books, to purchase for your own internet access, to have a place for your kids to go after school, that you don't need the resources to help draft a resume or learn English as a second language or any of the other myriad resources and services that public libraries provide. We're going to be talking about the role that public libraries play in building out public history, local public history specifically. All right, so I have a little thing. This is my model of the public history classroom. Public history classroom takes place within an academic setting There's two models you can go. One is an insular model. You can read books, talk about public history, have nice conversations, arguments, debates, which is perfectly fine. The other model that you can take is to open that classroom up to outside forces and make it more of an inclusive activity. So if we can, I want to go through four things that we collaboratively, as a class, really came up with a model for embracing collaboration. The first is with community stakeholders. And of course, primarily this was through the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground Conservancy, but also through Queens Historical Society, through the Macedonia AME Church in Flushing, through the Shinnecock Nation, through the Matticock Nation, and some of these were more successful than others. And collaboration is as much about failures as it is about successes. But the point is opening up that academic setting to include local community stakeholders. So if we get the next slide. The next collaborative thingy we have here is public libraries, of course. Specifically, we're out in Queens College in Flushing, Queens Library, the Jamaica branch. It's a wonderful public library system. And specifically Queens Memory, which Lori Wallach, the outreach coordinator for Queens Memory, a digital archives initiative that's been around for several 6 years now, and has been doing a fantastic job of documenting the history of Queens, the personal, community, and local histories of Queens. So if we can get the next slide. Information technologies really expand the ways that we collaborate and communicate with partners. So digital records, either accessing and putting them to use or creating digital records through oral history or through field work and photography and other acts of records creation, initiation. Digital archives like Queens Memory, social media as a tool to get out the message, to recruit people into an expanding community, to get people on your side, to use it for advocacy. So next slide. And finally, academia, which you'll notice comes last. And there's 3 tiers here. It's GSLAS, the Graduate School Library Information Studies, where I'm an instructor and where our students come from. There's the institution of Queens College. And the larger CUNY community, the Grad Center here and all of the wonderful branches of CUNY that exist throughout the city. Academia is capable of being a collaborative partner in providing resources, in providing time, in providing labor. My students didn't get any money for this, they earn credit, right? That's how this whole academic situation works, that contract works. So putting academia to use for local communities, I think is really, really important. So you can go to the next slide. Using this model, what I'm calling making the public history classroom public, and working within this framework, we were able to resurrect local public history related to the Old Town of Flushing burial ground in Flushing. And this is the site of final resting place for some 1,000 individuals during the 19th century, primarily African Americans, Native Americans, poor whites, half of whom under the age of 5 years old. So just let that sink in. Half of these people, some 500 individuals under the age of 5. And so I'll hand it over to the panelists to discuss this site and what we've been able to do with our collaborators, with an image and a question. If we could get the JPEG off of the preview. Okay, so this is a photograph that I took from within the site of the Old Town of Flushing burial ground, and you'll notice that it's now maintained as a city park, and it's looking out at Flushing Cemetery across the street. And Flushing Cemetery, of course, looks like a cemetery. You'll notice the gates protecting the exterior, the monumental grave markers, the nicely shorn lawn and sloping lawn. And of course, Flushing Cemetery has a history of segregation throughout the 19th century that in part contributed to this kind of auxiliary site, the Old Town of Flushing burial ground, previously known as Pauper's Field or the, someone help me out. The
Colored
Potter-
cemetery.
It was originally Pauper's
Pauper's.
Cemetery, and because at that time that was really basically black folk. But as it turned out, they started to call it the Colored Cemetery of the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground.
Mhm.
And that's when it became public for a lot of different things. There were a lot of plagues in the 19th century. And at that time, the burials were church cemeteries. And the powers that be chose, let's put these people who died from these plagues in a place where they won't contaminate anyone else, like the church graveyard or people, however those plagues were contacted. So they were buried in that cemetery as well.
Right, thank you.
And that has a lot to do with the current name of the place, which I will talk about later.
Right. So my questions for the panel, then I'll turn it over. I've talked long enough. How can we make sense of difference between these two sites? I mean, that's really what we're dealing with. And this image, I think, captures that difference pretty starkly. What do the tall black gates and the carefully groomed grounds across the road tell us that the rough landscape and open paths of the burial ground do not? This is a city park, not a cemetery officially. And how can we reckon with the weight of history under which these differences have been crushed into being? So for some potential answers, let's turn to the panel. We obviously have quite a few folks here. First is Jeffrey Delgado. Jeffrey is a product of the CUNY system and a former intern at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Currently, he's a graduate student in the MLSMA dual degree program at Queens College with a concentration in archives. And he's also a City Center for Culture and Queens Library Fellow and an outstanding student. And go ahead, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Just so you know, when I get nervous, I speak very quickly. So if I speak too fast, let me know. Like I said, I'm Jeffrey Delgado. First, I want to say that I think that we all figure there's a sense of duty between public historians that comes to us that we ideally try to bring a voice back to those who have been silenced or erased through history. And in today's technology, we can send out a mass amount of information to many people at a click of a button. So I thought it'd be a good idea to integrate these two by creating a timeline. And this timeline is really basic, it's nothing fancy. The best part about it is the fact that it's free, so I couldn't really delve into the technology part of it, so we can go next. First two articles that I wanted to address are this one says residents object to Potter's Field, and the next one opposed use of a Potter's Field in 1910. Now these both articles depict the citizens' reactions to the Potter's Field, and as briefly mentioned before, a Potter or pauper field were really common in cities where a lot of poor and marginalized people were living and couldn't afford an actual cemetery to bury themselves in. So these articles show that the citizens reacted very negatively towards the Potter Field, and inherently they didn't realize that they were paving the way to the Parks Department's ability to just take over this land and get rid of it for neighboring for times to come. So we can go next. This is a document from 1914. It's the official transfer of Potter's Field from the Flushing Civic Association to the New York City Parks Department. Now, just to put into context what the Flushing Civic Association was, this was not like your average community board that we have today that have representatives of the community coming together. This was more of affluent white men who had that were stakeholders in the community and didn't really care about what was happening around them. So we can go to the next one. We can go to the next one. Oh wait, sorry. Okay, all right. The plans to finalize the burial ground didn't happen until 1935. And once the property was transferred over, they named it as Martin's Field, and we can go to the 35 one day. Sorry, they were officially put on the supervision of the Parks Department. So again, this transfer of property illustrates the lack of consideration the Civic Association and the Parks Department had on people of color and low income. They simply paved over it without thinking of the families that were buried here. So we can go to the next one. All right. Now we can jump over to about 60 years to 1992, where local activists start to fight for the protection of this burial ground. leaders like Mandingo Chaska and Robbie Garrison, who was mentioned earlier, were at the forefront of this fight. And each article, you can go next. Each article after this were all articles in the 90s that were depicting their fight towards the preservation of the burial ground. Now, through the collaboration, you can go next, right there. Through the collaboration between the Conservancy and Native Americans, they were able to prove the remains of the Bunn family and some other Native Americans that may have been buried there. Although we can go next one, sorry. One more. Although the efforts of the Conservancy were seen, the New York City Parks Department refused to remove the playground from the burial ground. And as the fight continued, there you go. Nope, I'll go back. Sorry. There you go. As the fight continued, tensions started rising within the media, and like this article shows, racism was a very integral part in the fight for the burial ground. The article, I know you can't really read it because it's a terrible timeline, but it depicts a very discriminated explanation of what Mandingo was trying to do as the leader of the Conservancy, and it really gives out terrible facts of American history, so I'm almost curious as to why it was published to begin with. We can go next one. In 2003, they officially made a agreement between the Conservancy and the Parks Department after a decade of fighting for recognition. They agreed that they would make it into a memorial park adjacent to a playground. So we'll go one more. This is the last one, but now it's not the hopes that the Conservancy had for the actual site, because it was still adjacent to a playground, and all they really got was a commemorative plaque saying it was the Olde Towne Flushing burial ground. Now, in 2006, the city performed about $2.7 million in renovating the site, but the fight continues for the Conservancy, trying to get a little more, like getting commemorative obelisks or tombstones to actually make the site look like a cemetery rather than just a playground. And thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so next up is Cristina Fontanez. Cristina has a BA in Human Geography from the University of Puerto Rico. After spending 2 years teaching in Buenos Aires, she relocated to New York to pursue an MLS degree and a certificate in Archives and Preservation of Cultural Materials at Queens College. Very good decision. She's currently an oral history intern at the Brooklyn Historical Society, where she is processing an oral history project conducted in the 70s with members of the Puerto Rican diaspora as subjects. So take it away, Christina.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about an oral history I did and basically how I came upon this type of historianship, which is quite organic. So when the class started, the professor told us about the Olde Towne Flushing burial ground and gave us a bunch of articles to read so we could get a little bit of background and see who were the stakeholders. So I was trying to come up with an interesting approach to study the site that wasn't necessarily studying the history of it, because most of my classmates who were history majors were already doing that. So some of the articles, like Jeffrey showed, talked about the opposition to the burial ground. So I thought I would find out what were the current arguments against it being a burial ground, although it is, and just some people are in denial. But that didn't go as planned. So Jeffrey and I thought we would partner up, and we went to the archives to look at Queens and Jamaica to look for articles. So there we saw a man who was also doing research on Native American history. So we thought we would ask him, and he was very helpful. He pointed out some very good boxes to look through, and he gave us his card. Well, he gave Jeffrey his card. And when he came back, we realized that the name sounded familiar. So we looked through the articles. How is this? This one. And it was that man. Oh. Yes. So it was actually the Sachem chief of the Matinacog Nation, Chief Little Fox. This is him performing a ceremony at the Olde Towne Flushing burial ground. So it was not just any man, it was like the man we needed to talk to. And it was a crazy coincidence. We were very happy. just trying to not make a scene in the archive because we were so excited. So we approached him again, this time picture in hand. He couldn't believe it either because he didn't understand the site that we were talking about. So we asked for an interview and he gladly accepted. We went to his home. This is him at his home. We talked for hours. He was very glad to tell us about his history, about the issues with Native Americans in relation to the rest of society and within the tribes themselves. He gave us pictures of his family. So I want to talk about why oral histories are important, basically. Me as a student who came up with this type of historianship, like by a crazy coincidence, well, I learned a bunch of skills. How to interview. We took a workshop with Queen's Memory, which Laurie will talk about. How to do a bit of audio editing, how to index an interview, how to listen. And of course, the subject was super interesting. And for the narrator, for example, Chief Little Fox, he got to tell his story as he wanted to tell it, giving emphasis to the things that he thought are important in his life, as opposed to a historian coming in and talking about, I don't know, chiefdom, for example. And then for the community and researchers, well, oral histories, I believe, are richer than a written narrative of the events because they bring to light many other aspects that are not necessarily the topic at hand. For example, Chief Little Fox he basically didn't cover at all the burial ground, but I didn't think this was something negative because he did talk about racism. He talked about economic situations of Native Americans. He has a disability. He talked about that in the context of being a Native American in Long Island. He talked about the tribes, how the tribes have been developed. He talked about all of that. So maybe if we had gone about it in a different way, not necessarily an oral history, maybe an interview with question and answer, we wouldn't have gotten all that rich information that maybe wasn't my subject of study, but it's super beneficial to researchers. And also the fact that oral history are multimedia records. They include not only the audio, sometimes the video, we have pictures, we have documents. He gave us newspaper articles, which are part of Jeffrey's timeline right now, letters, all that can be used for further research. And so these all allow historians and archivists to bring important pieces of history to the archive where they can be made available to the community in general, which I think is super important. And oral histories recognize that cities are not built by politicians and wealthy men whose names are inscribed in plaques all over the city. The city's history is made by people like Chief Little Fox and the people sitting in this room. So, thank you.
Next up is Rudy Hartman. Rudy will receive his MLS from Queens College in May 2017. He completed his BA in History at Tufts University in 2007, and he holds an MA in Medieval History at Fordham University. So take it away, Rudy.
Okay, I need the thing. Just, how do I start?
There you go.
There we go. Well, this topic of this panel is how do we reclaim stories about the dead? In some cases, this can be oral history. In other cases, it's techniques we use to reconstruct histories from scant written evidence, because there actually is a sizable amount of written evidence if you know what to look for and what to do with it. I looked at the death records that Flushing maintained from 1881 to 1898, and I made them up into this Excel sheet here to make them easier to read. A lot of the difficulty was reading their handwriting. Now, while the old town of Flushing burial ground existed since at least 1840, death records for the town of Flushing only survived between 1881 and 1898. Microfilm of these death records are held by the NYC Municipal Archives, because as Professor Lorenzini can tell us, there was a big burst of, oh my God, we have to convert everything to microfilm in the 1980s and 70s. The surviving death records from Flushing are an existing piece of evidence, or an exciting piece of evidence, particularly because up until this point, there were only 4 surviving names we knew of from the site, from stone grave markers that no longer exist, but were mentioned in a 1919 that's too far, WPA survey of the land, which did write down, there was one that said George Bunn, James Bunn, and 2 other names from the Bunn family, which was of mixed Native American African. They were the bottom rung of society in the county, so they intermarried. That's point 1. The death records are not simply a list of names, however. Okay, we have these names, and it's amazing that we have about 300 of them. 290 persons who I was able to find listed under town ground is what they call it. And we do know there were grave markers before this. This is all from local papers beyond what I'm talking about here. They were made of wood, and the WPA report says there are grave markers here. This isn't unmarked graves, but they're rotting to pieces because they were poor people who couldn't afford stone, except for James Bunn, and we'll come back to him. But they're not just lists of names. There are several small but key descriptions of the persons interred at the burial site, which provide rare glimpses into their identities and how they lived. This allows their lives to be studied using prosopography, which is the fancy term for group biography. And I'm a medievalist, we do this a lot. We look at, all we have is a list of tax records of some peasants living in the 1200s. Well, figure out their demographic statistics from that. You can learn a lot about how they lived by looking at it as a group. One death record by itself is sparse. 300 taken together with demographic patterns, you start learning about how people lived. This information will help reinforce that the site is undeniably a historic cemetery. I can't believe people would still question this, and should be treated with the respect the status deserves by the local government. Point 1 from my study of all the people here is age at death. 47% were 2 years or younger. Infant mortality was high, but this isn't just bunch of unmarked graves for children. We have people in here who are 24% were 20 to 60 years old. There were 2 or 3 women who were black women who were in their 80s and 90s. One was listed as over 100. I don't know if that, if they have records of that, but people from every age group were in there and with extensive records. Next part is race. They actually list race, but they use black and colored interchangeably for the same family members, so I use that as just non-white. From the turn of 90, I say 300 names we have, 65% are confirmed non-white. The orange part here is confirmed white. This part, sometimes they just left it blank, but even if this was all white, we know this was a historically black cemetery, plus Native American non-white. But the real hero of the story, where things get interesting, the meat of this, is it lists in the death records parents' place of birth if they were from out of state. Some were from the South, about 11 people. I don't know if they were former slaves. They might have been old enough to do that. We'd have to check. But the exciting part is the various causes of death. What was the single leading cause of death? This orange slice here, 16.5% died just of tuberculosis. And when you look in the death records, you can see how a household goes down like dominoes, gutted entire families. The blue pie here of 30%, all other infectious diseases combined, of which we have tuberculosis is 47 people, 15 died of cholera, and 9 of whooping cough. This is childhood ailments such as rickets, stillbirth. Some babies got tuberculosis, I put them under here. This is accidents, and this is all other natural causes of death. Surprisingly, very few people got influenza. You can consider the Spanish flu was later. Heart disease was the biggest thing that killed people. Even list like a 9-year-old girl dying of heart disease. I don't know if they thought it was something else. Anemia was also a problem. I don't know if that was the sickle cell or some other form of anemia. Very few people got cancer, or at least if they got brain cancer, they just thought it was an aneurysm. But only 3 people were listed as cancer. But a lot of them were heart disease, also a lot of kidneys, bright disease. That was a big thing there. But no influenza and no cancer. Then we have that guy. I'll leave that up there. But the other exciting one of the ones I'm rapidly going, this is a 20-minute speech I've condensed into this, as you can tell.
Speaking of which,
Yeah, 60 out of the 290 persons in the cemetery actually are listed as having a job, but when you consider that there were 70 people of working age between 20 and 60, that makes sense. Of the black ones, out of 31, 13 were listed simply as laborer, porter, miller, whatever. However, there are 2 or 3 people who are listed as farmer, not farmhand, which I think might mean they own their own farms. Particularly, if they're a farmer, they're better off than a laborer and could afford a stone headstone, a grave marker, including one James Bunn, listed as a farmer, not a laborer. Coincidence? I think not. And James Bunn, his daughter, I was able to reconstruct family trees. His son George, he also had a daughter, Julia Hicks. She married Charles Hicks, whose farm was also in the Fresh Meadows area. I think this might have been a small enclave of free black farmer landholders. I'd have to check. Julia and Valentine Hicks had 3 children, also buried there, Clara, Ida, and little Valentine. So I can confirm with the death records, there are 3 generations of this family, not just dumped in an unmarked potter's field. There were grave markers. They had stone grave markers. And in fact, there might have been some variability in their socioeconomic status. They might have been smaller landholders. The bigger problem, and there's me standing at the thing. The bigger problem is, in 1996, the Parks Department commissioned the report by Linda Stone, which dug up everything with the archaeologists. And Stone did a good job. Her focus was on, are there at least 100 people buried here? Yes. Stone's report said, I think there might be up to 300 names listed in the death records. You should research this. No one ever told the Conservancy group of this, much less that she had already made a list of at least 100 names in her report. She didn't look at occupations and demographics like I did. But they knew of this list for 20 years, and apparently the Conservancy group only found out when we told them about it, which is shocking. I don't know if they did this through neglect or, oh no, maybe if they have this record of 300 named people buried there, this would help them get that fancy obelisk with names on it. But just, this is a cemetery. It is not a mass grave. There are family groups here. These are people who are not the poor of the poor. They were from many walks of life. Some weren't from here. The one guy I think was interesting was the guy who's listed as a black immigrant from Haiti who owned a printing press. But that was one guy. But there's a lot you can learn from this and future research. These are the people listed in the death records buried there. You can now go to the birth records of these family groups because, some people moved away and weren't buried here. Go to the landholding records to find out where Bunn's farm was exactly. So you have to crosswalk these names from the death list through the other lists that are for free in the municipal archives on the tape reel there. And you can actually, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg on this. There's a lot more you can study, which will in turn increase the argument for getting more funding from the Parks Department. I know I went over time. I've timed that a couple of times. And there's also hilarious photos that I took of a lady walking her dog past the no dog signs into the park.
Which about sums up the problem. The site is treated as a park.
I don't blame the park. There's signs saying no dogs. What else do I ask them to do? Maybe a person would be less likely to walk their dog in a graveyard. I don't know.
Right.
Something that looks like it has headstones in it.
All right, thank you, Rudy.
Yes.
Rudy's a force of nature as a researcher. I really have a lot of respect for what he was able to do with those records. And I know that Robbie is planning.
He's my hero.
There you go. Say no more. Okay, I think up next is Regina, right? Okay. Regina Cara is a graduate student in the MLS-MA in History dual degree program at Queens College. She's also completing a certificate in archives and the preservation of cultural materials.
Yeah, the tab you have your mouse on right now. Keep clicking to that. Or, was it deleted?
Do you need to go to the gallery?
Yeah.
Quick gallery. Dedicated gallery.
The first red link in the
Yeah.
text body.
Yeah, where it says gallery next to the picture.
Up and left. Up.
Yeah, above,
above.
above. Oh, just above.
Where's this gallery? There you go.
Great. So my contribution to the class was an online gallery exhibit, which is published on the Queen's Memory website and shown on the screen. If you were to try to find this gallery, what you would need to do is just go to the main website and then press the gallery tab at the top and then scroll down. I think it's under, Olde Towne Flushing Burial Ground Class Project. This exhibit was born out of what I perceived was a major need for our class to present our work in a cohesive way. It was also the product of perhaps some ambiguity on my part in the beginning of the semester. We were advised by Professor Thayer to choose a focus, or in other words, choose one aspect of the story of the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground to focus our research and deliverables on. For example, you heard projects about death records, Native Americans. We had other students in our class doing oral histories with Robbie and Mendingo Shaka. We had another student talk about the steps that we would need to take to landmark the site, and also how to present public history in general in the classroom. For me, no one topic was jumping out at me as something that I just had to study. Instead, what I found interesting about the site was how historically rich it was. If you were to go to the site, not only would you have trouble understanding it as a burial ground, but I think also it might not strike you as a space where so many defining issues like racism, poverty, gentrification, and eventually advocacy all come smashing together. So as a class, we were all individually researching these themes, but I wanted to create a product that would bring all of these themes together so that the public could see the rich and interconnected history that I saw. The interpretive framework for this exhibit was inspired by the oral history workshop Queen's Memory provided for our class, and they were showing us their website and some of their recordings and photographs they had on it, and they played a clip of an oral history interview by a woman named Gladys Weaver. In her oral history, Weaver explains her life in Jamaica, Queens in the 1950s as one of its only African-American residents. She recalls that most of her neighbors were Italian until public housing projects convinced homeowners to buy and sell property along racial lines. So after the oral history workshop, I wanted to find a way to incorporate Weaver's oral history and other oral histories on the Queen's Memory website into the exhibit. Weaver's story struck me as one that was parallel to the history of the burial ground. Just as the city had paved over the burial ground in the 1930s for the sake of creating better real estate, public housing efforts in the 1950s created the conditions for gentrification and the marginalization of minority communities. The function of these seemingly outside voices, or as I call them in the exhibit, community voices, is to create lost history, is to make the lost history of the burial ground a familiar history to the audience. Weaver's oral history and the outside community voices also featured on this exhibit show that these larger themes that the class was researching are not unique to the burial site, but speak to larger systemic issues in Flushing, the borough of Queens, and in the United States in general. Because these themes are so present in our everyday lives and throughout the history of Queens, this exhibit challenges its audience to think about how their everyday experiences inform and help them understand the history of the burial ground and their community. In essence, this exhibit challenges users to think historically. When we study or encounter the past, we inevitably see it through our modern lenses. While this can cause silences in history, in the histories that we tell, it can also foster better understanding and ownership of the past. My hope is that by thinking about Queens today and in more familiar terms, this exhibit encourages viewers to have a better understanding and appreciation for the burial ground and its historical legacy. Thank you.
Okay. So Regina mentioned Queen's Memory, which is the digital archive within which she built this exhibit. So Lori Wallach's going to tell us more about Queen's Memory. Lori Wallach is outreach coordinator for Queen's Memory, which is a digital archive that documents both the history of and contemporary life in Queens. The archive is a collaborative project of Queens Library and Queens College. So,
Can you just, I have a slideshow on there. That's it, yep. So yeah, yes, as Johnathan said, I'm the outreach coordinator. I'm based at Queens College, and I work with classes or individual students who would like to do projects in conjunction with our website. I just wanted to point out a few of the ways in which we tried to support the students doing this project. As Regina mentioned, at the beginning of the term, we did an oral history training workshop for the class. We played some of the oral histories that are on our site and did some exercises demonstrating how we go about conducting oral histories. And we provided them with some of the documentation that we give all our volunteers, most especially the consent form, which is really important for us whenever anyone does an interview, so that we can archive it and put it on the site and in the archives of Queens Library. We need to have these consent forms signed, so that's a very important piece to get. right at the beginning. And we also gave them some of the other forms we use, like the pre-interview survey, which is this tremendous survey, and it seems a little bit invasive, and I know everyone's a little uncomfortable using it at first, but I think, and I hope that the students would agree with this, that it kind of draws people out a little bit. It gets the subjects thinking about things they might want to talk about. So we encourage them to use that, and I think that it was helpful. We also worked with the students to collect proper metadata about not only the oral histories, but the photos and any other donated materials they received, so that they would get all that information right at the beginning. And when it came time to wrap the project up and donate the things to our records, we would have all the proper information. We wouldn't have to go back and try to recreate that from the subjects. And I just wanted to say that I thought the students who worked with us did a really excellent job of collecting that. And at the end of the term, I worked with several of them to prepare the records that you see in the gallery that's on our site. And we got some really nice additions, especially the Chief Little Fox interview is really the only representation of Native Americans in Queens that we have on the site to date, so we were very excited to get that. One aspect of this class that no one else has mentioned so far, so I'll mention it, is at the end of the term, they had their final presentations and they made it a public event, and they had quite a large showing of community people. I know a lot of Conservancy members were there, but also some other groups. I think Queens Historical Society was there, and a bunch of other groups, and it was really great. It was great to see all these community stakeholders coming together, and the students, I thought, did an excellent job of showcasing what they did. And for us at Queens Memory and Queens Library, it was very gratifying to have all these contributions coming in. Everything that they did is also on our blog site, even the ones that are not in the gallery. All the individual student projects are also on our blog site, which I think someone had up there, but I don't want to go through that right now. But and all the stuff is now available in the archives in Jamaica Central Library, so that can be used for further research, which was very exciting, and I'm very grateful that they partnered with us on that.
Yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to Queen's Memory and Lori for helping. This was sort of a messy class, as you can imagine. I really wanted to be open-ended and collaborative, but that means that things get complicated really quickly, and Lori never stressed anything, really, so thank you for doing that. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Robbie Garrison for maybe some final words. Robbie is a founding member of the Olde Towne of Flushing Burial Ground Conservancy, and an all-around wonderful collaborator and advocate for proper recognition of the site. So I'll turn it over to you if you have something to say.
I'm the living picture of what's left of oral histories. When you see someone with this color hair and you want some information about their past and their ancestors' past, now is the time to ask them, because we're fading fast. I walked into my civic group the other day and I said, oh my God, dead people are taking over my life. I don't even know any of them. And it's not just the Conservancy for the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground, but to Rudy's presentation, one of the other things that I'm working on is the Rantis farm people. About 3 or 4 years ago, the headstone of Wilson Rantis was found in the backyard of one of the Queens College professors. It led me to another book that was written in the 90s, and someone had done the research called So This Is at Leicester, which made us realize that the Rantis farm was quite a bit larger than what the 1919 map depicts, which is what we usually go by. But that was another reason for me saying, oh my God, dead people are taking over. But at any rate, back to the Conservancy. I joined with Mendingo once he discovered that this dilapidated playground in Flushing used to be the colored cemetery of the Old Town of Flushing. And I've always loved history, and I particularly love the idea that I lived long enough to be able to research African American history in America, in New York, in Philadelphia, wherever I am. In doing this, I learned so much about early Flushing. I don't believe that as much racism didn't exist as much in those early days of Flushing as it probably does now. When this land was bought, it was originally purchased because the city had started to outlaw burials in church cemeteries. And Macedonia AME Church would have been one of those cemeteries that had its own cemetery. In addition to that, the Flushing Cemetery had already begun across the street from this land that was purchased for our burial ground, and it would not accept black people at that time. The actual boundaries for the Old Town of Flushing Cemetery actually abutted the land that was actually going to be used for Flushing Cemetery, because it was just a roadway there that the Native Americans had prepared, or that the farmers used there. And it was called Queen's Lane or something like that. But getting back to the cemetery and where we are with the Conservancy, we are about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the reclamation of it, the removal of all the pavements after all the historical discoveries were made. We did actually, Rudy, get from the Design Commission, when we bothered to convince our borough president that they needed to come and talk with us, and they did something that usually doesn't happen. They came to Borough Hall and they actually met with the Conservancy, and they did actually bring a list of people that they said they had found who were actually buried there. The idea of bringing this list with them, which is only about 100, it's only about 100 people. That's what they presented to us, and pretty much why we kind of poo-pooed it.
I think that's the list from Stone's article.
Yes, yes. This is what they brought. And we sort of poo-pooed it because right away they said, why are you only trying to memorialize these 4 people? And our response was simple. It's because these are the 4 people we know about. These are the 4 people that were listed having headstones that were recognized in 1919. And their consensus was, why don't we do something that would memorialize all of these people, so there are at least these many more people there. Our information at that point was from Linda Stone. There are a lot more than these 100 people that they listed and brought in. So we were like, yeah, sure, the more the merrier. For us, it meant we were going to have 100 headstones over there, you know? Little did we know what they were saying is, and talking about, was building a wall. Something similar to the Vietnam Wall with all the names on it. And so right away, that didn't set well with us because that wasn't what we were looking for. We had worked with the Parks Department. We had talked about an obelisk just with those 4 names on it. We had talked about a sitting space around the obelisk that recognized those 4 names. We were always talking. We were always compromising. The largest compromise is that we were never trying to get back all of the land that was the original burial ground. Because if we were doing that, it would have been part of 46th Avenue. It would have been a part of 165th Street. It certainly would have been all of the playground that we said, okay, at the end, give a playground for the children, almost all the way up to 45th Avenue. So none of anything that they were saying was that. So that was about 2 years ago. And for some reason or other, one of our members visited a cemetery over in, I think, Astoria something. And the cemetery itself had decided to do a wall that memorialized those unknown dead in that cemetery. This is an active cemetery. And so she said, well, maybe we can do something like that. I don't know. And I went to sleep that night and I woke up with a dream. Okay, let's have a wall. Let's memorialize all the names that we can find. You've got space on this thing as long as there is 4 indentations of headstones that has exactly the names that we're asking for. And of course we're pushing it because we'd like it to be sort of we'd like them to be juxtaposed out, sort of 3D, so that it actually looks like they are headstones placed into this wall. And then there's plenty of places for the names. So we hope we're going to see in January some kind of fruition to all of this negotiating with the design people and with parks people. And I've run across some of those articles back from when the city was thinking of turning the cemetery into a playground for the upcoming community that was there. And those articles, a lot of them are listed in my album that I carry with me everywhere I go, that I lent to Johnathan and his students when they were doing this. I have now added Lori's memory project in it. And I thought this morning coming here, what am I going to do with all this? Now I know, I'm bringing it to you. I don't know, it's just so much stuff, and you can get really, really, really involved in it. Last but not least, I'd like to say to you all, we are about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the reclamation. The first celebration was in 2006, and on November 12th, we're going to be doing the 10th anniversary celebration of recovering it. All of the original Conservancy members are still with us. We've added a few more on. The most of the people that Johnathan knows were not able to make it today, but we have Erica, Miguelina, Hailita, who is one of my library friends, came, and the young lady from Macedonia. Yes, please continue to come and come out, and we urge everybody, if you can, be interested in this project, because these students are heroes. I am telling you, Rudy gave me a stack this big of death registries between the years that he was telling you about, and he highlighted as many as he could see that were buried at town grounds. I even found a Rantis relative on there, Rudy, with the other project that I'm in. Her name was not Rantis, but it mentioned her father, who was Troy Rantis, who is the brother of Wilson. And it mentions that this woman was buried at the head of the Vly, which was that land that Wilson Rantis owned by Queens College. Oh my God.
Yeah, head of the Vly was the Dutch for head of the river where the Flushing River is.
I'm sorry.
And sometimes I have to guess on the spelling because you're reading a handwritten thing.
Well, maybe that might be a good sign. I think we have a few-
Thank you. I'm
Yeah,
done.
thanks, Rob.
Thank
And I would like to leave, we do have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has questions.
Yes, I would like to deal with the community stakeholders. And Macedonia was one of the participants. Are you telling me that there were bodies under that church?
Oh, yes. When the cemetery was closed, it was negotiation between New York City and the church to build what is currently where you would normally enter from Union Street, to build that part of the church. That's where the cemetery was, okay? And they took the bodies out of there, and they took them to Flushing to have them reinterred at Flushing Cemetery. But at Flushing Cemetery, they would not take them because there were no records of who these bones belonged to.
So they brought it back.
The church goes all the way back to 1811.
Yes, it does.
And for whatever reason, I don't know, the records for the people who were buried in the churchyard was not available to Flushing Cemetery. So Flushing Cemetery said, we won't take unknown burials.
So it was brought
And
back.
so they brought them back to the church, and the very astute pastor at that time decided, okay, we will bury them under the church, which actually made part of the church a cemetery. And so when it came time to do lots of other things with the church, they couldn't do it because it's actually cemetery land.
It's a landmark?
It is in the.
So how
in
can they
the-
tear it down now?
Well,
How can-
see, it depends on how many people care. That has a lot
We
to
all
do with
care,
it.
but we were told that we had no voice.
Oh, yeah, you had a voice, you know, but there are some people that probably just had a bigger voice than you. And knew who to go to and how to work it. The church is old, And nobody will ever be able to convince me that if you can upgrade the meeting house and Bound House to the point where it is currently used, and these are buildings that were built in the 1700s, not 1811. These were buildings that were built back then. There's no way it could not have been saved. But the same way eminent domain took place of that entire black neighborhood and made it a parking lot for the people of the upcoming growing Flushing back in, this is when Flushing was Jewish, okay? These people wanted parking space for their businesses, and there were many of them. When I moved to Flushing, I used to shop there with my children. But that's what happened, and it became eminent domain for the buildings and the businesses, the black businesses that were there. And it just happened. And in the Rudy's, he mentioned that the city made all these agreements with the housing projects. That's how Bland projects came about. And of course, James Bland was a famous black man, you know, that said, well, we'll name the projects after James Bland, blah, blah, blah. We've come a long way since then. And there are things that we know how to fight a little bit now. We don't have to accept what somebody says as truth. But then that didn't happen. And now what has happened with Macedonia sitting there, it's this one little bottle of water sitting in the middle of gigantic buildings that are taking over the entire neighborhood of Flushing. And so the fight was lost from the very beginning, except they could have still used those bones to keep the facade for however long they wanted to do it. But that means the community within the church had to care, and everybody didn't. I stand by that. You can tell
I
Robert Garrison
understand, no, I
said
will not.
it.
All right, well, we are out of time. Maybe one more quick one.
I was just thinking, for Flushing Cemetery to accept the bones, I know they do a study to see how old the bones are.
Well,
I think I know that in a physics class.
Yeah, you probably did, because that's what happened with the African burial ground down in by City Hall. That's actually what happened. But Flushing Cemetery it's private. It's a profit-making business. That's not what they're into. So they had no desire to study these bones or to see how old they were.
So we have to educate the children.
That would be a good thing.
History.
That's what Professor Thayer is doing,
Yeah,
and his
sure.
committee is doing.
All right, well, on that note, thank you so much for coming. I just want to say, I haven't been teaching very long, but watching your students become your colleagues is really one of the great things about this job. So thank you to you four, and to Lori, and to Robbie, and the Conservancy, and everybody.
And I have a question now.
Yeah.
And it's basically addressed to Rudy once again. His presentation had stuff there that I would love to have available for November 12th.
Sure.
If there's some kind of way.
What's
we can get
November?
through to that.
Maybe they could show up.
November 12th is when we're doing the 10th anniversary
10th
celebration
anniversary.
of the reclamation.
Maybe to come.
All right,
I'll
let's
see what I can do.
thank our panelists.